Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Amanda Martin, and yes, I am the President of the National Education Union. What I'd like to do before we start the call this evening is just to run through some housekeeping. Firstly, you'll need to know that this meeting is being recorded, so it is available not only to the National Education Union to help us answer any questions and help input to our advice that we give out to you as members, but also in case anyone needs to watch it later on that can't make it this evening. Secondly, you'll notice posted in the chat is the NEU's behaviour code with online meetings. Have a look at that if you haven't already seen it before, and please remind yourselves that kindness is the best way forward when we're on our online meetings. Okay, I also want to note that we are in webinar format, which means you'll only see the panellists this evening in front of you. You won't see yourselves and you won't hear yourselves. The many questions that you might well ask will come through to me as the chair, and then I will feed them into our panel. But just because it's a webinar, it doesn't mean we don't want you to get involved. There are two ways that we want you to be involved this evening. Firstly, that is through the chat. So in the chat format, although we've got the behaviour code, we've also going to be posting from our tech team any information that we refer to, any links to the union websites, and any other information that is discussed from our panelists this evening. It's also a place, and I can see that so many of you are already saying hello and welcoming each other. It's just so great to see so many of you on the call this evening and already interacting. Please do post in there and write in there. We also save the chat, and that goes towards helping us to put together our advice that we give out to members as well. And the other way you can get involved this evening is through the Q&A button. So that's the question and answer button. If you put your name and where you're from, not necessarily your school, you could just say your area and the question that you would like to ask. If there's a specific panelist that you want to ask it to, then please put their name as well, as we'll hear from those as we go through the meeting this evening. I think that's it for me, other than to say we have an amazing tech team here with us this evening in Dorothy, Nikki, Richard, Mike and Amy. They are the people helping you in the chat, helping you with your questions as they come forward, and recording and making sure that we're all kept on to speed in this meeting this evening. And the final person, but by definitely not the least person to thank, is Sam Riddle, who is our signer this evening. Sam and her colleague have been with us on many Zoom meetings from the last few weeks and are most welcome. I think I want to just start by saying thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for giving us your time. I do hope that you find this meeting helpful. Please post in the chat if there's anything more we can do to support you throughout the meeting or also towards the end of the meeting. Please try and refrain asking questions until we've heard from all of our panelists, and I'm going to introduce them one at a time. But without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to your amazing executive representative, Helen Porter, and she's going to give us an introduction to the meeting this evening. Welcome, Helen.
Hello, Amanda. Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. Great to have so many of you joining us this evening, and I do appreciate your participation, especially as for most of you this will have been a very busy day, whether you've been working in school or you've been remote working from home. So we do appreciate you joining us this evening. So there are many very difficult challenges ahead in independent schools, and of course therefore as well for members working in independent schools. Many independent schools are struggling to survive financially, and so they're having to trim back, and unfortunately there are redundancies being made and other problems occurring, and it's likely that they will increase even more so in the autumn term. So it's very important that every workplace has a workplace rep, and if there isn't one in your school or college, then please consider becoming one. There's very good training and support available. I've had more than 30 years experience as a workplace rep, and I can say that it's been a very rewarding role, which I enjoy a great deal. It helps you to develop a better understanding of terms and conditions of employment and school procedures. And if you do have a workplace rep, then please support them. Please tell them about your concerns and your fears going forward. Discuss the risk assessments and the checklists with them. And also perhaps consider becoming a health and safety rep, because ideally in the present climate, every school would have both a workplace rep and a health and safety rep who would work together. So thank you very much, and I will pass you to John.
Thank you.
So John is the national official for the independent sector, John Richardson. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. The inaugural NEU Independent Sector Zoom meeting on the 20th of May was a great success. We had over 1,000 members participating, and members commented afterwards that they took great comfort and strength from being part of a strong union community. The hot topic then was the wider reopening of schools. And our workplace reps have reported to us that the NEU checklists for the primary and secondary phases for the safe reopening have been widely used in the sector. And so the news has moved on, and just this week, the government has stepped back from forcing schools to reopen, vindicating the NEU's position that it was too early to do so safely. And it's not just the NEU, many parents and many schools agree. And so let me just give you an illustration. It was shared with me by an NEU rep yesterday, who is the rep in a day and boarding school in Hertfordshire. So it's just a little snapshot. You may recognise it, it may be different in your school. But he said that the school itself had decided that it was far too early to open the boarding houses, and at the very earliest they'd be opening in the autumn term. So that's a school decision. In reception and year one, the attendance was around 50% of those eligible to come back. Now that dropped. In year 6, it was only 20% of those eligible actually came back. And for years 10 and 12, there was a parental survey which indicated that they were only going to send 15% of their children back into those classes. So that's a snapshot. And in part, it might be a reflection on the success that many independent schools have had in setting up online teaching for the older age groups. You can see the difference in attendance in those different ages. And it is an opportunity for us to actually commend our members, many of whom are working extremely hard online, both academically and pastorally, whilst also mastering new technologies, adapting to altered relationships, both with students and colleagues. So we want to take a moment just to say thank you very much to those members. Now, last time out, I mentioned the excellent TES article written by an NEU rep in an independent school on what it was like being a union rep under lockdown. It was entitled, "It is not business as usual." So you'll get the gist of the title. And if you haven't read it, please Google it. It was not business, it's not business as usual, TES. It's a very, very enlightening read. So whilst health and safety has to be our #1 priority, we are not complacent about the lockdown collateral damage to our members' jobs, terms and conditions. And I think we should remember that the NEU lobbied successfully via the TUC for government support for businesses, which was centred on the retention of jobs. And I think even in our wildest dreams, we didn't think we were going to get the job retention scheme. Now that, we should also note, is an unprecedented injection of state cash into private schools. And it wasn't the only measure that the government has taken. There are also rate relief for those schools that pay rates, and there's also the possibility of temporary loans. So there's an unprecedented plethora of financial support, which the NEU played a small part in achieving. We've also used our parliamentary briefings with MPs to call upon support for schools, including independent schools, as and where there is a need. So let's just reflect that we have had some success in that area. Though saying that, we have to accept that the furlough money, as welcome as it is, will not fully offset the potential losses to fee income, but it will go some way to mitigate the losses that schools are facing. So in the meantime, we have had to fight some fires, and let me give you some illustrations. Our members who work in the 16 independent schools run by the Inspired Learning Group had, with little or no notice and no consultation, threats of job losses, pay cuts, being dumped out of the TPS, and even at this height of this pandemic, having their sickness benefits cut. With no listening from the employer, we were forced into the public domain, and our robust response, our robust press release was picked up by Sir Ed Davey, who is the acting leader of the Liberal Democrats. He endorsed the union's position, and it was reported by the well-known educational journalist Warwick Mansell. And many of you will know, unfortunately, that your membership of the Teachers' Pension Scheme has come under assault. And we have had, our members in individual schools have had some notable successes, and nationally the union has been raising that profile. So you may have seen, but if not, again, you can Google it, the report in the TES on the 4th of June, which was reporting on an NEU Freedom of Information request, which debunks false claims made by some employers recently that they are one of the last employers in the Teachers' Pension Scheme in the independent sector. We know it's rubbish. And so, whilst the figures are edging up, we have to accept that 144 independent schools have left or indicated they're leaving the TPS. It's out of a total of 1,171 independent schools in the TPS. So it's around 12%, so nothing like the majority. We are also seeing a slow trickle of independent schools closing down. Now, I'm aware of around 9 since lockdown. I suspect the numbers are higher. I've seen all sorts of unsubstantiated numbers. So, for instance, the Sunday Telegraph said it might be up to 30 without really giving any evidence. But no doubt that will increase. And there are some notable schools in that list. Just last week, we heard that York Minster was going to close at the end of the summer term. Now, York Minster is one of the oldest independent schools in the world. It can trace its history back 1,400 years to 627 AD. So this is quite something that a school of that history is closing. And the week before that, the alma mater of our Prime Minister, his prep school, Ashdown House in East Sussex, also announced it was closing. So our members are standing together and they are facing the challenges. And that strength is attracting more members. So today, the NEU membership is at the highest levels that it's ever been. And I will just report on the membership in the independent sector. And our membership now is over 33,500 members. That's the largest the membership has ever been. Our workplace rep community, the density of our reps has increased 20% since the lockdown. Our members are understanding the need to get organised and to lead that in their workplaces. So finally, to conclude, we know that the full extent, the collateral damage of the measures taken to combat coronavirus will not be fully known until the autumn term, when independent schools will know the effects on pupil numbers and will also see the safety net provided by the job protection scheme slowly being removed. So there will be substantial threats to jobs, terms and conditions, and we need to be organised and we need to be ready to combat that. And I would ask every one of you listening to ask the colleagues in your workplace if they're in a union. If they're not in a union, ask them to come and join you in the NEU, because the more members that we have, the stronger your voice. And if you don't have a rep in your workplace, please volunteer. And if you do, offer to help out as part of the rep team. And as always, look to see whether you can strengthen your collective voice through your statutory right to trade union recognition. Because standing together and acting collectively, you will influence the things that affect your daily working lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you, Helen, for both of your inputs. You have really got a great team here with regards to knowledge, information, and also, knowing what's going on with regards to terms and conditions. And we realise the huge impact that that's having on so many of you with the uncertainties. And John has just outlined a few of those. So if you do have any questions, please make sure that you put them in the Q&A. The next person up to speak is one of the Assistant General Secretaries, Andrew Morris, and his department deals with bargaining and negotiations. Andrew, thank you.
Thanks very much, Amanda. I'm really pleased to be on the call with well over 300 participants. I'm going to say a few words about some advice that's been published since the last of these calls, specifically about vulnerable employees and employees who are living with people who are vulnerable, or employees who are in other higher risk groups. It's been clear since the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak that some individuals are unfortunately at greater risk than others. And as time has passed, although the reasons still aren't always clear, the differences in risk to different groups have been confirmed. Now, as a union, the NEU has always been clear that tests of safety have needed to be set and satisfied nationally and locally, but we've been equally clear that risk assessments need to ensure that the workplace is safe, not only for workers generally, but also for workers individually. And hopefully you've all seen and used the NEU checklists on workplace safety for primary schools, secondary schools and colleges, special schools and early years. Those checklists are now accompanied by advice which is considering the risk and vulnerability of individuals, including those that are in specific groups which the government defines and accepts are vulnerable, and in other higher risk groups as well. And today we published advice specifically for Black members as well. The point that we're making in all of this advice is that risk assessments need to consider individuals' vulnerability individually, not just as a group. And individuals can be significantly affected not only by their underlying health, but also by their age, their sex, their ethnicity, and other factors. So our message to you as members is that if you're concerned, tell your employer and tell them why you're concerned. And that will ensure that your employer knows your circumstances, is prompted to consider your circumstances, and knows what they should consider. So we're advising that anybody who is defined as clinically extremely vulnerable, or as clinically vulnerable by government, or who lives with or cares for someone in either of those categories, they should work at home. And that should be possible, in our view, in all schools. Others may need to work at home as well if their circumstances such as age, ethnicity, or combination of factors suggest this. So do read the advice and do make sure that your employers consider it as well. In cases of disagreement, we're advising you to seek your GP's advice in the same way as you would if you were unwell, because schools need to be safe for you personally to prevent that, and we will support you to help ensure that. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Andrew. And if you have any questions on that, please do ask, because we're absolutely able to go into some more detail. Next person I'm going to bring onto the panel is the last panelist before we start to take questions, and that is Jayne Phillips. And Jayne is our Head of Employment Rights Unit. Thanks, Jayne. Welcome this evening.
Thanks, Amanda. Hello, everybody. It's nice to have an opportunity to talk to you all. So John asked me to talk to you about essentially about the sort of health and safety legislation that's there to protect you if you are concerned about your safety. So it follows on quite nicely from what Andrew's just been talking about. There is a fairly substantial amount of health and safety legislation that places obligations on all employers to protect not only their employees but others, and in schools that is pupils, they have to protect their health and safety as well. And every single school up and down the country has an implied contractual duty as well to take reasonable care for the health and safety of their employees and to provide them with a reasonably safe workplace. And the use of the term reasonably doesn't water down that duty, but it simply recognises that not all dangers can be reduced to zero risk. So there is still a fairly heavy expectation on schools and other workplaces to look after their staff and other people who might be attending that workplace. And you as an employee, and me as an employee, we all have a common law right to refuse to expose ourselves to a risk or risks that arise from a breach of that duty. If our employer fails to take reasonable care of our health and safety, we can refuse to go into the workplace. And if an employer has failed to take reasonable steps to make a workplace or systems of work reasonably safe, an employee has the right to refuse to work or to follow any instruction that would expose them to such an unreasonable risk. So that instruction, that's usually a management instruction, and we often advise members that you can't unreasonably refuse to follow a management instruction. So people get very nervous if we say you don't have to follow what your employer is telling you to do. But if you're being instructed to do something, for example, to enter a safe workplace, that instruction is not lawful. So a refusal by you as an employee to follow that instruction would not be a breach of your contract of employment. And that principle is set out and well settled. It's set out in case law that goes back as far as 1930. So this is nothing new. We're not, testing the waters on this. It's very clear that those are your rights. And that implied contractual right not to attend an unsafe workplace, that's given a statutory footing under the Employment Rights Act 1996, specifically Section 44 and Section 100 of that Act. And what Section 44 provides is that an employee should not be subjected to a detriment, so a cut in pay or a disciplinary action, because they exercised their contractual right not to attend the workplace because they reasonably believed there was a serious and imminent risk of danger. That's what the legislation says. And Section 100 provides that an employee who is dismissed in such circumstances is what's known as automatically unfairly dismissed. And that's just lawyers' language to say that you don't look at any you don't consider whether the employer's been reasonable in dismissing them. If they've been dismissed because they refused to attend an unsafe place of work, that is unfair. Simple as that. And we hope, really, that what those two pieces of legislation do is act as a deterrent, so that if we or you say to an employer, we don't believe a workplace is safe, the employer will recognise that you have a right not to enter that unsafe workplace and act accordingly and act reasonably. I will say that nobody can legislate against unreasonable employers, and there's quite a few of them around. So it's a remedy, and that's how the law works. It provides a remedy when things happen. But if anybody was to exercise their right because their workplace was unsafe, the union is there to give that full support. And we really believe that people should be able to exercise this right. And that's because there's this issue of serious and imminent danger. And what does that mean? Well, it's something really that can only be judged on facts. But what we feel is that the regulations that were introduced during the current pandemic, they describe coronavirus as a serious and imminent threat to public health. So that's a direct replication of the terminology being used. And our position is this: if you use the NEU checklist, that's likely to expose any failings that would be evidence that the risk to you and to pupils of contracting coronavirus is not being adequately managed. And that is a danger. And if there isn't proper protection in place, that danger could be serious and imminent. It isn't a sort of get out of jail free card. You have to reasonably believe that there is that serious and imminent danger. But the checklist, as I say, really is evidence that exists. I think it's also important, I think it's important that the belief in terms of danger is not only to your health and safety, but also to others. So you might feel that it's not safe for a colleague or for pupils. It is an individual right. So some people might feel that a workplace is safe given their own personal circumstances, but others may feel that a workplace isn't safe for them because there's not sufficient protection in place. And that will, as Andrew's talked about, that will be people who are deemed clinically extremely vulnerable, or they may be living with somebody who is. They may be clinically vulnerable, or again, living with somebody who is, or they may be at a higher risk of contracting virus and suffer more serious effects should they contract it. So if an individual feels the workplace is unsafe, what we say is you should speak to your workplace rep if you have one, or speak to your branch, and they will give full support. There's lots of resources on the NEU website and available to our reps and branches, so they know exactly what to do at various different stages to establish an approach so that you are protected. Now, if the whole workforce has concerns, then you might want to raise those individually still, or the rep might want to raise concerns on behalf of everyone. I think it's really important that even if it's only you that doesn't feel safe, it can be really beneficial if you get your colleagues to understand what your concerns are and get them to support you in raising those concerns. But, it really should be done at an early stage, because really what we're trying to do is encourage employers to resolve any concerns and to ensure that it is safe for somebody to attend their workplace. Not attending the workplace really is a last resort that we hope people don't have to do. And you should always obviously maintain that you are prepared to continue to work from home, even if your workplace is not safe. And that is a very, very quick overview of the rights that you have as an employee. Thanks,
Brilliant.
Amanda.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jayne. And I think the next set of questions will be for you, Jayne, and potentially Andrew as well, if you wanted to come in. They're all based around furlough questions. So we'll take those firstly together. So Rachel says, I have been on furlough since the 1st of April. My school want me to come in and work full time for 3 weeks from the 29th of June. Then they want to place me back on furlough for the summer holidays from the 19th of July to the 31st of August. Do they need my agreement to place me on furlough from the 19th? And then Helen has asked, with the guidance about furlough being updated to say that anyone being furloughed after the end of June must have been furloughed from the 10th, should those members who were furloughed through Easter but not since feel confident they won't be furloughed over the summer holidays? And Lillian, currently furloughed since April. If still furloughed during the summer, can I work in a government school if government offer paid catch-up sessions in school? So over to you first, Jayne, and then obviously Andrew, if you want to come in from there.
Thanks, Amanda. I think I will say, if you'd asked me in January, that we would have been using the term furlough quite so often. Now, I wouldn't have believed you. I don't think I even thought the word existed until March. But it has been a huge lifeline, I think, to people. But it is complex. And I will say that it doesn't create any employee rights. It's a subsidy that employers can take advantage of. But all our advice is based on interpreting the guidance that the government have produced. And the government do have quite a nasty habit of changing that guidance as and when it suits them. So I just give that as a kind of, just to make you all aware that that's the position. So Rachel, I think the short answer to your question is yes, they would need your agreement. At every point or every stage that you're put back on furlough, your employer should get your agreement, and they should clarify any terms of that furlough and ideally give you some idea of how long that might last for. Helen, the 10th of June date is the cut-off date that the government set at quite the last minute, rather unhelpfully. But basically what it means is that if you have not been furloughed prior to the 10th of June, then you cannot be furloughed in the future. And that's mainly, I think, because they're going to make changes to the scheme, there's going to be contributions, etc. But if somebody was furloughed over Easter and then taken off furlough, that doesn't mean to say that they can't be furloughed over the summer holiday, because they were still furloughed during the period up until the 10th of June. So I can't tell you whether or not people will be furloughed over the summer holidays, but what I will say is the guidance doesn't prevent your employer from taking that step. And Lillian, the guidance all along has said that you can be furloughed by one employer and then work for another employer. There is nothing at all within the guidance that prevents anybody from doing that. The HMRC guidance is explicit to say that's exactly what you can do. All it requires is that your employer who has furloughed you doesn't give you any work whatsoever. Now, the potential problem that you may hit is that we are expecting, and we think they might come out tomorrow, but we're expecting some new direction from the Treasury around how the furlough scheme will work after the 30th of June. And what we do know is that they're going to ask employers to start making a contribution. Now, whether that impacts on your ability to work elsewhere, I think I would have to say that that does remain to be seen. We'll have to, the devil is always in the detail with this scheme. So I would say, based on current guidance, that's not a problem at all. But I think I would wait to see what the amended guidance or the new guidance says about the changes to that scheme.
Thank you. Andrew, did you want to add anything further to that? Okay, thank you. We've got some more questions coming in, so I'll read these and then the panel can answer. So Sean has asked, some private and state schools are asking in year 9, year 10 and year 12 into school to do end of year exams via social distancing. Can they do this? That's the first one. And someone anonymous says, we have been asked to volunteer to work until the end of July. I informed SLT that I had a holiday booked from the 13th, the first week of the holidays, which was accepted. If this doesn't happen, can I be obliged to work? And Ian has asked, are you aware of any issues being discussed about the return of children in boarding school? And finally, I'll do 4 in this section. Vincent, what about the pressure on schools who do not go back soon, who will not have jobs in September, as the schools will not exist then? So who would like to take those to start with? John, I'll come to you. Thank you, John.
Well, let me, I won't remember all those questions, there's so many there, but let me start with the summer working. Well, I guess that's a euphemism about being asked to volunteer. And I would think that suggests that your employer believes that they cannot force you to do it. And indeed, it's very unlikely that they could. You would have to check your contract of employment, but normally school terms and summer holidays are specified. You will no doubt, if you're a teacher, have the catch-all in the independent school contract about doing the reasonable requests of your head. Well, we, as a ready reckoner, we often talk about reasonable requests, that if the length of the school day increased by 10 minutes to meet changes to demands, that might be reasonable. But if it was an additional half an hour, we would say that was not. So if you were suddenly being asked to work an extra 2 weeks in the summer holidays, we would be most likely saying that that is not reasonable. Now, clearly, if you were genuinely wanting to volunteer, then fine, that's your choice. And if there is provision going to be provided, we would say that you are either genuinely volunteering or you get paid. You know, it's as simple as that. And, you know, whilst you can choose what you want to do, as a union, we need to protect your pay terms and conditions and make sure that you're not taken advantage of, because this is important, that it is a profession, and part of a profession is that it is respected and paid appropriately. So that's a general answer. I mean, obviously, if you are concerned about it and it continues to go on, you need to speak to your rep. You need to get individual advice. We can look at your contract of employment. So boarding schools, well, where do we start with boarding schools? Are there issues in boarding schools? Well, yes, there's 101, and I'm sure there's many more than that. The thing about boarding schools is that they will vary quite considerably in terms of their ability to change and to facilitate social distancing. So some of them will have room, and some boarding schools I know are talking about in the dorms leaving certain beds free, but others won't have that possibility. And you know, the 2 meter distancing is hard enough in schools. I mean, it's ridiculous in boarding schools. I mean, you might have 8, 10 kids in a dormitory. How on earth do you keep them apart? It's totally impossible. So there are issues about that, and the part of the planning for boarding schools is using the NEU checklists, the phase, the primary, secondary. And I think in the chat, people have been helpfully pointing out that there is some very useful advice from the Boarding Schools Association, both their charter and also they have a checklist. So our advice would be to use those to supplement the NEU advice on boarding schools. But there's many things. I mean, I know that the 14-day quarantine that many boarding schools are already trying to get, and have already made arrangements for their overseas boarders to come back 2 weeks early and quarantine them. Now, if you read the newspapers, you suspect, because of the summer holiday clamour, that 14-day quarantine might get binned. If you look at the 2 meter rule, if you read the newspapers, and it's not just schools, but the impracticalities of actually keeping that going, that might get binned. And clearly the government has got spooked by the economic consequences of the measures taken, and it's likely there'd be changes. But boarding schools are having to make their arrangements based on what's happening now. And I think the big question mark for them is the confidence for many of the overseas pupils. I think it's around 60,000 overseas pupils. I mean, half of that number with parents overseas, but half of that number parents in the UK, and that's according to the Independent Schools Census this year. So it's a large number, and it will be about the confidence about whether it is safe for their children to attend a school, and that's a really big question, and that's going to play out. But I know there's lots of stuff around keeping the day and boarding house staff separate. Those staff that are more closely connected to the physical well-being of the staff, whether that's the matrons, the school nurses, or spare a thought for the cleaners that might be having to go in and change the laundry of somebody who might have the symptoms. All of that is 101 questions. So we could talk about boarding schools for quite some time, but I'll shut up because I know there's other questions that we need to talk to. So could you, Amanda, could you remind me the other ones we had?
The other two were linked to I guess it's a bit that you talked about around what happens with the pressure of schools not opening and then potentially closing. You know, what happens?
This is a real worry. It is a real worry, and there's no way getting around it. And it is part of what you face on a day-to-day basis because you work in commercial businesses. This is the day-to-day reality. The numbers so far, I would say, are not that big because, you know, there's guesstimates about how many independent schools close in an ordinary year. And we've estimated that in the past of up to 60. So, you know, and we've got, when you look at the 9, certainly the 9 I'm aware of, they will all reference other issues, underlying issues. I mean, York Minster is very interesting because there's a massive subsidy from the tourism to York Minster. And obviously that attraction is closed, so that money is not coming through. So that's a very particular source of income. So, but it is a real worry. And as I said, we have played a part in securing a massive cash injection, and that will protect schools for a certain period of time. But there is a reality, and we're going to have to face that. In the past, we have seen the potential soft landing that is available to independent schools, which isn't available to other private businesses, that schools can be saved by converting to free schools or academy status. And certainly we've supported that when we've seen independent schools do that. The last time I counted, it was something like a dozen or so independent schools that had taken that route, simply because there wasn't enough bums on seats. And we would support that in terms of protecting members' jobs and protecting the school. So these things will be ongoing. And what we say is that we should be, the staff, the union, should be part of the discussions about measures that might be taken to avert redundancies and measures that might be taken to save the school. The problem is that quite often, with good intentions, governors will keep going until it is too late. And then the parents rally around and say, to save our school. It's too late because the finances are not good enough to sustain it. But the other option I should mention is also that there are chains of schools that do take on schools that have had some difficulties. And that's another possibility, that you throw your lot in if you're a standalone school with other schools and take the savings of economic scale. And if there is pain in terms of redundancies, we want to make sure that our members are treated as well as they can be. And so some of this is about managing the situation, about voluntary redundancies on enhanced levels, a wide pool of selection, and indeed some people are quite happy to put their hand up if the terms are correct. So I will shut up now because that's quite long.
Okay, Sean's question was around exams. I mean, I think the answer is no, but I'll come to Andrew Morris if he wants to give some more detail. It was around asking year 9, 10 and 12 in to do end of year exams.
As this issue might be more common in the independent sector than in the state sector, there's no specific DfE advice, because the DfE's position is that they've closed schools and cancelled public exams. Limited reopening is now permitted, but it's very limited. It's restricted to year 10 and 12, to a quarter of the cohort, minimal contact within the school, minimal contact between groups, small groups, excluding and limiting visitors. Opening for year 9 pupils would be illegal. So it's not really on for a school to say, let's have all of year 9 in to do an exam. It's not safe, and it shouldn't be happening, and it's certainly not in accordance with the spirit of the government's advice, which is more than advice, because of course it does reflect the law of the land with the legislation that's been enacted to give government new powers to impose these restrictions.
Thank you very much. I've got 2 more questions. I have got more after that, but I'm just going to do them in 2 blocks instead. So firstly is from Ian. Do you have anything to say about the way that Ofqual is working to help those in year 10 and 12 the future exam? Clearly this all depends on the impact of a potential second wave of infection. And a teaching colleague who is from a BAME background and in in the union, we say black members. This is being asked to come into school to teach year 10 and 12 returning next week, questioning what risk assessments have been done for BAME staff and requirement, and was only told that they were more likely to catch COVID at a supermarket than coming into work. And if they could not, that their department will have to pick up the slack, singling them out. Is this acceptable? So I'll come to you, Helen, first with regards to the Ofqual, and then Jayne, can I come to you for the BAME question? Or, yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Amanda. So yes, indeed, the NEU is working with Ofqual now, and I'm a member of the Policy Research and Campaign Strategy Group of the Executive Committee, and the Policy Department, headed up very ably by Nancy Ellis, are preparing a submission. And they are, for example, at the moment, calculating how many hours of teaching time the current year 10 and year 12 students have missed, and therefore how the course content they are expected to have completed before the examinations next year will need to be reduced. Possibly looking at there being more emphasis on testing the skills that the students will need to progress to study at the next level, and less emphasis on them covering so much content. So the NEU are very much involved in that consultation process with Ofqual. It's a very important part of our work. And of course, yes, it does indeed depend on the second wave, which we are expecting, but we will be nimble and we will be working on that and adjusting our advice once we know what impact the second wave is going to have.
Thank you. And Jayne, if I can come to you on the question around black members.
Of course, yeah. No, it's not acceptable at all. There is a lot of evidence out there that shows that black people are at a much higher risk of contracting coronavirus and suffering much more severe effects, including death. They're more likely to die. So that has to be taken into account when the school is looking at its risk assessments. And Andrew has spoken about all the resources that are available on the NEU website for our black members. I really hope that the colleague is a member of NEU, because they will hopefully then receive an email that's gone out tonight that will link them to all that information. But essentially, if the school don't do anything to put in extra measures, in particular, we would say by allowing them to work from home, then they need to look at submitting the letter that I spoke about earlier to the school. And, you know, if the worst comes to the worst, then they may reach the conclusion that they just can't attend work, or they can't attend the workplace. Again, I really do hope that they are a member, because they really will benefit from support from their workplace rep, if there is one, or from the branch, or ultimately from the regional office. But they shouldn't at all have to put up with that kind of attitude. That's not at all appropriate, and it's not supported by any of the evidence that's out there.
Thank you, Jayne. Okay, I've got two more questions. The first one is similar to one we've asked, but I want to ask it because it actually extends. So my school is opening for some year 10 and 12 next week. We've been asked to volunteer to go in. So with both of those things we've covered, but this is something different. We have no consultation, no risk assessment, and they will not engage with the union. What can we do to try and get them to speak to us? And then the second question, do schools have to provide key worker children provision in the summer? Can schools have summer clubs either provided internally or by external providers? So I'll come to John for a brief answer on the risk assessment, and then one of the other panels for the other question.
Yeah, so very briefly, by law, your employer will be required to do a risk assessment. And what I would suggest you do is you simply put in the request in writing so that there is a record, and that you then seek advice from the NEU. But I'll put the request in writing for the risk assessment. You might also, if you haven't already, taken reference to the NEU checklist for primary or secondary, depending on your phase.
Okay, thank you. Helen, did you want to answer the key worker question? If not, okay, I can answer that. So for the moment, I would be saying that no, the government have said that children are not expected to be in schools regarding over the summer holidays. However, the NEU today did launch a 10-point programme where we believe recovery of education, and one of the things we've looked at is local authorities putting together summer holiday clubs, summer holiday information, not in a way of catch up, but in a way of children who have been out of school going into that. And it may well be that your school have already provided summer holiday clubs in its various format, and you may have members of staff who are contracted to do that. If so, that would be perfectly reasonable for them to be doing. But if they're asking you to do extra, then there needs to be negotiations and conversations. You have to look at your contract based on what it is you are being asked to work, how many weeks of the year, and whether that is set up in your school. But we are asking, the union are asking for local authorities to look at using school buildings to set up summer holiday clubs, but to be run by other organisations. So that's the answer with regards to summer. And Gavin Williamson himself has said he does not expect schools to be open. So those are those questions. I'm just going to come to some more. I've got Martin. Are we going to have a checklist more specifically for independent schools, which will take into account boarding and the return of international students? Great question. Stephen, what pressure, if any, are the government putting to help independent schools who are struggling to stay open due to loss of fees? And one more. The prep school I work at is exploring opening to all years, including 7 and 8. There seems to be the view that the government will allow flexibility to schools that have smaller class sizes and sufficient space. What is the NEU position? So I'll firstly, who wants to answer those?
I'm happy to take the first one about the checklist, Amanda.
Thank you.
We've published checklists for primary schools, secondary schools and special schools, which should cover the majority of issues that will apply in a school with boarding provision. But we recognise that boarding provision is a specific area in itself that needs to be additionally considered. Our website includes a redirect to the advice that's been published by the Boarding Schools Association. And I think with some commentary on that, which John can say more about if he thinks that he needs to. But I think between those two sources of advice, the advice that is for the school in your sector, whether it's primary, secondary or special, and with additional advice for boarding provision, which is provided by specialists in the area, then that should cover all the bases.
Thank you. Jayne, did you want to come in on any of the others?
Yes, the prep school that's opening to all years. So as Andrew mentioned earlier, the government exercise legal powers to close all schools, and they are the ones who dictate when and how schools reopen. And there may well be some flexibility as time goes on, and I'm not sure that's necessarily a bad thing. You know, the NEU isn't here to stop schools opening. We just want them to open when they're safe. So if all years in a school can open safely, and the checklist can be completed and all the measures put in place, then, you know, we're not going to act as an obstacle to that. It's, you know, we just want schools to open when it's safe for them to open, because I think what we're all desperate to do is ensure that there isn't a second spike, because the second spike will be a lot worse than the first one, so we hear. So it is all about safety, and it's safety of staff, of pupils, and the wider community in the area where the school is. So if it's safe, I don't think we'd have a problem with it.
Okay, thank you. And there was just one other, I think, John, you kind of covered the conversation around the pressure that we're putting on for independent schools with regards to finances, and the union being right at the start of that, right through to furlough, all the way through to grants and various business things that could come through. Is there anything more you wanted to add with regards to the pressure that we're putting on?
Well, I think that that is an ongoing conversation, and it will be partly determined by how things play out. I mean, clearly, if there is mass redundancies and mass closures, the pressure on the government will be much greater. But I did mention also we have been using our parliamentary briefings to call for specific financial support to schools as per need. So it's an ongoing conversation, and it's something that we are acutely aware of, and it is something that we will be acting upon.
Thank you. And the NEU also has a counsellor network as well. And so in your area, you will have counsellors that will be in the wards in your schools. So they are also a great source of lobbying with regards to gaining support for your educational establishment remaining open. I've got one more question I'm going to ask, and that is, I have asked for a meeting with the governors and SMT for all staff to discuss our jobs via Zoom. Can furlough staff join? I'm concerned that our pensions will be under scrutiny at this meeting. Could the governors legally call a consultation about our petitions online, or must it be face-to-face? So kind of two questions there. Can furlough staff join? And also, if they're going to be talking about pensions, you know, can that be started, a consultation online? Jayne?
Our view, I can deal with the whether it takes place online or not. Our view is that it's much easier for these types of meetings, if possible, to take place face to face, but we recognise that that isn't always possible. I kind of would be more guided by John's view on this, but I think I would be keen to try and stop that all being discussed online. I think that kind of consultation needs people to be able to easily take part in it, and it's a lot more difficult to do that when you do it via Zoom or any other platform. If any of you, I'm sure you will have, if you've ever had meetings with your team of maybe 4 or 5 people, that is a very difficult meeting online compared to how it is face to face. So I would push for any discussions around pensions to be delayed until such time that a face-to-face consultation can safely take place. That would certainly be my view.
Thank you, John. Would you just complete the answer?
Yeah, I mean, just on that particular point, I would say that our position should be strongly that we reject any attempts to conduct consultation online for the reasons that Jayne has said. And we issued some joint guidance with the Association of School and College Leaders and the National Association of Head Teachers, jointly putting our position that things like disciplinary hearings, capabilities, redundancies should not be conducted online because you cannot do that properly. It's similar to the TPS. Now, that's a position I would say we should adopt as a union and you should adopt in your workplace. Now, that's not to say that your employer won't go ahead and do it. And in our NEU Independent School COVID-19 survey, the results of which are on the website, conducted in May, it was something like 45% of school employers that were conducting consultation put a halt to it. 55% continued, and we are aware of 1 or 2 employers who think that it's a good idea to start this consultation online now. So our position is no, it shouldn't go ahead. I think many employers will agree that's a reasonable position. Some will be persuaded if we say it strongly enough, but we should also be aware that it's possible that they will go ahead with it. One other thing I would say about pensions is that unless they have mentioned it, don't bring it up. You should just assume that you're in the TPS. Don't start the conversation because they'll think you're ready for it to be taken away. But apart from that, the general question about having the conversation with the SMT and governors, good on you, because it should be a meaningful discussion and potential negotiation on these major things which affect your terms and conditions. It shouldn't be done behind closed doors. You shouldn't be involved when it's all too late.
Thank you. And before we finish, we've got 1 minute to go. I'm just going to come to Helen Porter, who is your executive representative, and I'm going to ask her to give you 2 or 3 tips and things that you can do to go away from this meeting today. Helen.
Thank you, Amanda. So certainly there are very, very challenging times ahead. So things to do in your school: organise around your rep and your health and safety rep, work together, have a collective voice, and put that collective voice to the senior leadership team. Remember, there's strength in numbers and speakers won. Also, bear in mind that as we go forward into the autumn term, this is a very dynamic situation, and the government's going to give us new guidance, new regulations, and things are going to keep on changing. So do keep looking at the website. We have some excellent advice and guidance documents on the website. We have frequently asked questions, and we keep on updating those. A lot of that is due to John. Thank you very much, John, for the excellent work you do on the website for the independent sector. But do keep on looking over the summer, because things will change, and it's really important to keep up to date. Thank you.
That's brilliant, and some really good bits of advice. I'm well aware that this is the end of an extremely long day and almost the end of an extremely long week for so many of you. Thank you so much for joining the call. I do hope that you found it important. And a lot of the key themes this evening are around being collectively standing together, being a rep. If you don't have a rep, rally together and have 2 reps in your school. Don't be alone. You are in a union for that reason. And the National Education Union, you are in very good company. We are working hard, and we hope that you have found this helpful and that your representatives here have provided you some really good information. Please do look on the website. Please do look for the next Zoom meeting calls that will come up. And please be safe. Take care. Thank you.